Wednesday here in Washington, the National Press Foundation held a forum titled New Trends in Terrorism. Speakers at the forum included former CIA Director William Colby, Dr. Bruce Hoffman, a terrorism specialist for the RAND Corporation, and Senator Larry Pressler of South Dakota, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Our coverage of the Press Foundation Forum is coming next here on C-SPAN.
Good afternoon. I'm Catherine Turpin, Vice Chairman of the National Press Club's Forum Committee. National Press Forums are co-sponsored by the National Press Club and the National Press Foundation, aided by a grant from MCI. The forums, which are open to the general public, are aimed at providing working media with a variety of perspectives on a wide range of subjects. Today's forum looks at terrorism, new trends in terrorism, and the recent World Trade Center bombing. Our panelists represent and will present a number of different views on the subject. Ronald J. Ostro, today's moderator, is a correspondent for the Los Angeles Times Washington Bureau. He covers the Justice Department and law enforcement and has been an investigative reporter. Prior to joining the Times, Ron was an editor for Business Week and got his start as a reporter in the San Francisco Bureau of the Wall Street Journal. He has also written books, including one entitled The FBI and the Barragans, which he co-authored with Los Angeles Times Washington Bureau Chief Jack Nelson in 1973. Each of our panelists today, who Ron will be introducing shortly, have been asked to make a short presentation, after which he will moderate a discussion among them and take questions from our audience. I hope you won't be shy in asking them. We have a microphone set up in the middle of the floor, which we ask you to go to before you ask your questions. Let's now welcome Ronald Ostro, our moderator, to conduct the program. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Assembled here are experts who know this subject and analyze it with some care in their work. They are, starting from my right, Senator Larry Pressler of South Dakota, now the ranking Republican on the Terrorism Subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who may have to dodge out for a Senate vote, but promises to come back, right? And former CIA Director Bill Colby, who has a distinguished career in intelligence. And then Doug Gow, the Associate Deputy Director for Investigations, oversees all FBI investigations, and himself has an extensive background in foreign counterintelligence. And then Bruce Hoffman of the RAND Corporation, who's now their leading expert on terrorism. I was thinking about the timing of this panel, and I must say it could not have been more timely. On the one hand, of course, you have the World Trade Center bombing that snuffed out 6 innocent lives, and the standoff in Waco, to a lesser degree, with the Davidians. And this could indicate that we may be entering a new era of terrorism, perhaps the product of religious-directed terrorism. If so, that carries with it special characteristics in the way of fervor and in the way of special problems for those who would detect and prevent terrorism, especially in our nation with its First Amendment, where the very First Amendment guarantees freedom of religion and bars the state from interfering with it. But then on the other hand, you have mass demonstrations last weekend against the IRA violence in Dublin. The violence that took 2 children's lives. It's rather rare that someone demonstrates against the IRA. Perhaps it's a harbinger of new resistance to terrorism. The questions posed by these trends are many. Is the United States equipped to deal with it, or are our immigration laws so porous that an overhaul is drastically needed? Are the FBI's hands tied by the Attorney General's guidelines on foreign-sponsored terrorism, or has the balance with civil liberties been properly struck? Is the United States likely to be more and more the victim of terrorism? With just that as a limited backdrop, let us start off with Senator Larry Pressler.
Well, thank you very much. I shall be fairly brief here so I can listen also to the other panelists. The Senate is in session. I have my beeper. If I have to go, I'll come back. This afternoon we are working on the Stimulus and Economic Development Package. That's what the Democrats call it. We call it the pork bill on the Republican side. So in Washington, I can assure you that gridlock has been replaced with pork lock, at least for today. In any event, on the Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Organization Subcommittee, we have a task before us to try to provide a comprehensive plan of legislation that would thwart terrorism. And our principal function on that subcommittee is to prepare the authorization for all the international organizations, how much the U.S. will contribute, including the State Department and then the international banks and UN and so forth. But under the leadership of Senator Kerry, we also deal with the subjects of terrorism and narcotics. I've recently sent Senator Kerry a letter outlining what I think we should do this year in the subcommittee to try to offset this. There's a differing point of view on many of these things. If we do really crack down on some areas where terrorists can flourish, it means a diminishment of certain civil rights that we have come to cherish. And it depends upon the trade-offs that we're willing to make. I might also say that it's not just in the Foreign Relations Committee, it's also in the Judiciary Committee, which I also serve, which deals with some of these problems. I have here Title VII of the crime bill that has been proposed by Senator Hatch and the Republican side of the aisle, but it has been opposed by the other side of the aisle. You know, both parties on the Senate floor give the same talk on fighting crime or fighting terrorism, but there's a difference in approach. The Republican approach has included it criminalizes the foreign murder of U.S. nationals. It includes the death penalty for terrorists who murder Americans. It would tighten visa requirements for foreigners entering the United States. It would take stronger actions against countries that sponsor terrorism. It would enhance detection and countermeasures against emerging threats in foreign nations. And it would support and promote international anti-terrorism agreement. I might say that it's hard to pass some of these things, though, when it comes down to it. On the motor voter bill, Senator Simpson offered an amendment just here a week ago that would be just the first feeble step that would increase civil penalties for people who fraudulently use voter ID cards to obtain U.S. citizenship. And that amendment was tabled 58-40. That's basically a party line vote. And maybe I sound partisan here, but there is a difference in approach of the two parties in the Senate of the United States. I would have to say, someday I'm going to be a political science professor, so I might as well tell it like it is while I'm still in the Senate. But there is a difference in approach between the Republicans in the Senate and the Democrats as to how to address these problems. The Terrorism International Matters, Section 7 of the Republican crime bill, Section 701, Terrorism Civil Remedy, provides U.S. victims of terrorism with a federal civil cause of action, which now is frequently not the case. It has several really tough provisions. It criminalizes the providing of material support to terrorists. Section 703 authorizes criminal forfeiture of property used in or derived from terrorist activities. The Alien Witness Cooperation Act authorizes admission into the U.S. of up to 200 aliens annually who cooperate in terrorism or other investigations. Dropping down, it improves FBI access to telephone subscriber information in connection with counterintelligence and anti-terrorism investigation. Criminalizes the foreign murder of U.S. nationals, and a number of other provisions. But I think that's something that needs to be passed. I also think we need to pass some of the things Senator Simpson is taking the first steps at suggesting. And, you know, there's always a heated debate about the crime bill, and we had the new Attorney General before the Judiciary Committee, and both sides sound the same, but there's a big difference on the approaches, for example, on habeas corpus. There's a big difference on the exclusionary rule on domestic criminal law, but there's a big difference in the crime bill on Section 7, terrorism, international matters, of the two bills that are before us. I've sent Senator Kerry a 3-page letter suggesting suggesting what our subcommittee should be looking at legislation or activities in terms of fighting terrorism. And let me say, first of all, that I've long been concerned with the proliferation of nuclear materials. I've had the Pressler Amendment on Pakistan, which still stands. It's the only amendment that's ever passed where our foreign aid is conditioned on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. But more seriously, we have the business of just carrying nuclear weapons in a suitcase. And if the terrorists at the World Trade Center had nuclear materials, the horrible results would have been much worse than they were. And both our FBI has got to, and our government has to have the ability and the authority to use intelligence measures to prevent something like that from happening. And it's my strongest feeling that our government needs stronger tools. Some of the things that I have suggested in my letter, and these are general things that our committee should be working on this year, is to work to increase cooperation with foreign governments to counter terrorist threats, to detect and counter emerging threats in foreign nations before they pose a major risk to the U.S. national interest, to urge foreign nations to stop making direct deals with terrorist groups, to pressure foreign nations to end their support in violent activities such as providing weapons, training and training sites, safe havens from prosecutions and similar assistance, and work with the former communist countries to forge multinational anti-terrorist efforts. There are a number of other things regarding the strengthening of the rule of law, support and promote the following international agreements: the Convention on the Making of Plastic Explosives for Purpose of Detection, the 1988 Protocol for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts of Violence at Airports Serving International Aviation, the 88 Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Attacks Against the Safety of Maritime Navigation. We must extend the prosecute or extradite principle to attacks on airports and maritime targets to help prevent repetitions of incidents such as the 1985 Rome and Vienna airport attacks and the 86 hijacking of the Achille-Lauro passenger line. We also need to strengthen measures to thwart terrorist activities in the U.S. Some of these are in the crime bill already, the proposed crime bill. It's my feeling that we must tighten visa requirements for foreigners entering the United States. In the Department of State, I think we need a reorganization to merge policy bureaus and offices currently dealing with narcotics and terrorism. I believe strongly we must authorize the death penalty for those convicted of terrorist activities that result in loss of life. And we need to review treaties and memorandums of understanding on extradition with other countries or on extradition, including the so-called snatch rule, which the Supreme Court has upheld. So those are some of my preliminary thinking. It's a very difficult problem because I know that many of these things involve a trade-off of convenience or some of the traditional liberties that make this such a easy country to move around in and make it maybe a safe haven for terrorists. But if these activities do continue, I think we have to consider this, especially in the visa area. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to take some questions and cover other areas after I've had a chance to listen to my colleagues.
Let us turn now to Bill Colby, who served as Director of Central Intelligence in the crucial, what I would call reformist years of 1973 to 76. After a full career of distinguished intelligence service to the nation, he began that career during World War II, parachuting into France and Norway to work with resistance forces for the Office of Strategic Services.
And that starts with my feeling about what terrorism is, because I was called a terrorist by the Germans since I was operating with the resistance behind the lines, and they said very clearly if they found you there, they would execute you as a terrorist. Well, I protested that I really wasn't a terrorist. I was just applying the dictates of our own Declaration of Independence, which says that it is your right, it is your duty to overthrow a tyrant, and that that doesn't make you a terrorist. If you analyze it a little further, I think the easiest way to define what a terrorist is one that injures innocent bystanders. That there is some legitimacy and a total frustration in attacks against an establishment, against the military or police forces of an occupying power. That's understandable, but it is totally unacceptable to kill or maim the innocent bystanders, which is a characteristic of most of what we call terrorism. It's also what holds the shock value of terrorism, because it does hit the innocent, and we all see ourselves as a potential victims of it. We are in a slightly new trend, I think, on terrorism, although there's nothing really new about terrorism. It's been around for years. We had our Ku Klux Klan terrorists. We've had the Weatherman terrorists of all sorts and types in this country. They've existed all over the world. But I think most of us think of terrorism these days as somehow emanating from some central stimulus. The Iranian government, for instance, in its revolutionary urge, or some major drug lord center that carries out that kind of thing, a mafia-like situation. But I think we are seeing, particularly in the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center, a phenomenon which is much more informal and a little bit more difficult to handle. That by inspiring certain people to a degree of frustration, you encourage them to think of doing what they can on their own without being either supported or stimulated by some central force. Now, this is a very dangerous thing because there's lots of bases for stimulation of that kind of thing. We saw the Muslim cleric who was giving the extreme speeches. Now, you can't really link him by those generalized speeches into a particular plot to carry out a terrorist mission. Is it within the limits of his free speech to advocate that some major changes happen? Well, I think most people would say it really does, unless it comes to direct incitement. Oliver Wendell Holmes' famous crying fire in a crowded theater. That otherwise you ought to be able to say pretty much what you want. I think this is a complication to the problem now, because as an intelligence problem, you don't have a sort of an easy target. If you can just get a man into the group, then he can tell you what the overall plans are. Here the group is so small, it's so informal, that there probably isn't an overall plan. They're making it up as they go along, and your chances of having an agent at that level are fairly small. There's no question about it that enormous strides have been made in recent years against terrorism, though, both internationally and nationally. The director of the FBI 7 years ago said we had frustrated some 40 different terrorist attempts in this country from abroad by good police work, by good intelligence work, and so forth. Really, that has happened. And you've seen major terrorist threats in various countries put down. Now, the nub of the problem in my mind is how they are put down. The Italians had the Red Brigades for a while. It terrorized the country, all throughout the world, throughout the area. And the Italians went to work very hard on it. They lost a prime minister in the process, but the Red Brigades are gone. They did it through the law. They did it by very careful, steady police work, following up individual leads, and then getting them in these enormous iron-bound courtrooms that they developed, and conducting trials against them, protecting the judges and the prosecutors involved, and the Red Brigades are essentially gone. And you can say the same thing more or less happened to the Baader-Meinhof in Germany, that they really went to work on it, and the Baader-Meinhof except for an occasional blast we've had in the last year or so, essentially is gone, and that threat has reduced. We have, of course, in this country, practically eliminated the aircraft hijacking by the mere business of putting us through the screening as we go in onto the planes. Here is a security move that had enormous effects over the long term. Do you get them all? No. But have you very much reduced the problem? You're darn right you have. There's no question about it. So you can say that if a terrorism becomes serious, it's probably going to be suppressed. The good way to suppress it is by the law, because there is an alternative, and that's by illegal action. As we saw the Argentinians, who were faced with a major terrorist threat from the Montoneros, and they began that process of disappearing people totally outside the law, and they're suffering ever since as a result of the deaths and the destruction that the authorities did in their struggle against the terrorists. The same for Uruguay. They also have suffered, although there weren't quite as many disappeared there, but they were substantial. So the lesson then in fighting terrorism, I think, is very important, which don't lose your cool. Keep to the law, keep using your machinery. The various recommendations that the sender has, I noticed he referred to the rule of law, and his measures are designed to improve aspects of our legal tools against this. There are certain limitations I'd be a little hesitant there, and that's the extraterritorial application of American law, which is kind of an issue with various other countries, that if some American goes abroad and he is hit over the head in a back street in Caracas, the question is whether the head fellow who hit him over the head is subject to being kidnapped and brought up to America for trial. That's an extreme statement of it, but nonetheless, the other countries are going to be resistant to that kind of a thing. So something has to work out. Do we work cooperatively? Yes, through the various intelligence link, through the police links, all the rest of it, in order to build up our knowledge of these people. So I would say that we have a problem. It's not terribly different from the problem we've had all along. We have to improve some of the weaknesses that our process shows that we have from time to time, but we shouldn't panic. We shouldn't run around and just declare that this is the most terrible thing happening in the world. I submit to you that the most prevalent form of terrorism to which most of our citizens are exposed is walking through a center city at night. Now, that's not a terrorist gang from abroad, but it sure is terror if you can't walk through the center city at night. So it's a matter of getting these things, these kinds of threats into proportion and taking the steps necessary to overcome that kind of problem. We have our own terrorists. We have the situation in Waco and other places. We've had the various other posse comitatus and so forth that we've seen around who are dangerous. But I think they can all be controlled through a democratic society. One of the reasons that some of these are particularly frustrated is that they feel that there is no legitimate way for them to put their thoughts forward. And if you do have a democratic society, there are legitimate ways. And so it's harder to recruit people to become terrorists in that regard. So I would say that we have a problem. We shouldn't panic about it. The editorial writers will certainly write about them. But I think a cool hand and a cool head will continue to enable us to contain this kind of a problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Colby. Let us turn now to Doug Gow, the Associate Deputy Director for Investigations of the FBI. He joined the FBI in '65 after 6 years in the Marines, where he attained the rank of captain. Before that, he was, if you'll pardon the regional bias, he was educated in God's country, namely Southern California, where he did both graduate and undergraduate work at Redlands. In the FBI, I think a key assignment for this purpose was when he became special agent in charge of the FBI's Washington field office in January '87, because so much of their work is foreign counterintelligence. And then finally, he became assistant director of the intelligence division, headed up the division responsible for, in those years, counterintelligence work. And then in May of last year, the year before, in May '91, became Associate Deputy Director for Investigations of the FBI. The FBI's number 3 man, Mr. Gao.
Thank you very much, Ron. I would like to just very briefly kind of acquaint you with the FBI's response to terrorism and also build on a couple of the comments that were made by Senator Pressler and Mr. Colby. I think a key point that Mr. Colby has made is this issue of not panicking because of the recent incidents that have happened within this country. If we look at statistics, they show one picture, and now we have a couple of incidences, and there is perhaps a leap being made to indicate this is a harbinger of things to come. Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. But as Mr. Colby has said, I think, we have to maintain, so to speak, a cool head here, and as the Senator indicated, that we have a number of preventive things in place, and basically these have been a reaction to terrorist incidents over the years, such as our magnetometers at airports, if you've been into a courtroom, the procedure that you have to go into in order to enter a courtroom, and a variety of such things like that. And the balancing act there is, how do we balance that off against the tolerance of the citizens and our ability to freely move in our type of society, and how much do we want to give off in order to tighten down on those things. In looking at the preventive side, it must be balanced. If there is actually a need, such as heightened tensions or instances that occurred during the Gulf War, then I think people, are willing and eager to enter in and see the necessity of it. But if it is in a period of calmness, so to speak, then it becomes very bothersome. And generally, perhaps I may be a little off target here, but the citizens of this country become very annoyed when it takes you, instead of a half hour to check into a particular establishment, if you're going to have to wait an hour, et cetera, to do those types of things. But again, let me get back to the statistics. If we look at the worldwide incidences, and the FBI is always quick to point to other people's figures, and these are State Department figures, so if they're wrong, I don't take any credit for them. No. We'll show you that going back from like 1987, we had worldwide numbers of incidents of terrorist actions was up in the 800s. That dropped off in '92 to a little over 300, in the high 300s there. The interesting thing is that from 1987 to 1992, we had a buildup of targeting of American interests and Americans in here, and the percentage, while the numbers of incidents were dropping, we had a higher degree of Americans being targeted in our international terrorist incidents. At the same time, our figures over the period of years would show that going back in the last decade, say from 1982 up to the present 1992, we had a fairly dramatic reduction of numbers of incidents within this country, or terrorist activity in this country. Go back to 1982, we recorded, by FBI figures, 51 instances. 1992, we were down to 4 incidences, and there with no casualties amounting to any of those incidents whatsoever. During this period of time, as Mr. Colby alluded to, that the FBI has recorded what we refer to as a number of preventions, and that is being able to interdict an incident before the activity takes place. And what we're looking at is activity that could result in bodily harm or damage to a facility or some such thing as that. The point I guess I'm trying to make is that while the United States has not experienced the same levels of terrorism as we've seen elsewhere in the world, we do have a situation now with the political situation that is ongoing, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, the republics of the former Soviet Union, and the problems that politically that they're having, with the reemergence of Iran trying to assert itself in the Gulf, the aftermath of the Gulf War, the situation in Yugoslavia, that all create a turmoil. And I think historically we've seen where we've had major political and economic changes that have resulted in upheaval and a displacement of peoples, et cetera, that has been a catalyst for terrorism. Now, the question then comes, you know, what effect will that have on us within this country, and what will be the spillover? The nexus that can be drawn to that is, again, in this changing environment, as we in our business environment and our economic environment spread out, increased travel by businessmen, increased business opportunities, joint ventures with countries, as we enter into peacekeeping types of modes, our nexus to the peace process in the Middle East, again, opens up an avenue for retaliation against us by someone who is, you know, depending on what their interests are and where they lie, whether it want to be retaliation for non-involvement, involvement, siding with one side or the other, creates an environment where we do have all this percolating that could result in some type of action here within the United States. Again, we get back to a very open society. The FBI's program, and you know, we are the lead agency in this fight of terrorism within the United States, lead federal agency, but we do work within a broader context of the government's anti-terrorism program. We cooperate very heavily with a wide variety of agencies. Our program is basically built around two precepts, and that is a preventive stage and a reactive stage. The preventive stage is our ability to track, gather intelligence, and interdict before an incident occurs. The reactive, naturally, is after an incident has occurred, such as the World Trade Center, Pan Am 103, any of these types of things, is for us to respond in an investigative mode and then, you know, complete the investigation as we would any criminal investigation, bringing all resources to bear on that particular incident in there. We basically break the terrorism question down into two aspects. We look at it from a domestic side and an international side. And just very quickly, a definition of domestic terrorism, I like to refer to it, that's our homegrown tomato. Those things that are spawned within this country. Ku Klux Klan would be an example. The international terrorism, I don't think I have to, you know, give you an example there. That would be an organization that is directed or acting at the behest of a foreign entity or government and sponsored by that government in order to carry out some type of an operation here. And we've had a variety of things occur in this country over the year, murders of dissidents and other political figures of other countries here. But the point also that Mr. Colby raised here is that, you know, we have to approach this, and what we do is through the application of the existing laws that we have and using that precept of the rule of law in order to address these problems. There are a number of things that have been put in place to ensure the safety of our citizens. There are other things that we can do. We can, you know, improve the coordination between the agencies that deal with this problem. Well, I'm not saying the coordination is bad now, but there's always things that we can do better, and I think everyone knows. And if we stop at a certain point and say, you know, we've reached the maximum, then, you know, our progress, it really is not going to be going forward. But there are things. There are other entities within government. Looking at the visa problem, I believe the Senator brought that up. That is a problem that can contribute to the tightening up of a variety of things here that can help law enforcement in looking at undesirables not getting into the country and being able to, you know, determine who exactly is coming in and what action should be taken if they don't fit certain criteria in that area alone. The message I would want to leave you with right now in my brief statement is, again, you know, I do not think in any way it is time for the you know, people to panic because of what has happened, but to have faith in law enforcement, in the federal agencies and state agencies that are investigating these incidences, and as they go forward. There's many things that you know, the ordinary citizen can do to help in that. And we preach this all the time with regard to just, you know, the standard crimes that are committed, and that's the involvement of citizens. If people are willing to come forward when they have information that relates to a crime that has been committed, or if they see something that they feel is truly out of the ordinary, and this has occurred, and I could give you examples of this, where someone says, you know, I'm kind of embarrassed to, you know, come to you, but I saw this happening, and I just want to, let you know. And with the combination of those things, of looking at the visa question, perhaps some other preventive measures, and then just the ordinary citizen having an awareness, but not having a fear, and being able to operate and move freely about in our society, I think, then we will be able to have a grip on this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gao. Our final panelist in the introductory statements here is Bruce Hoffman, who's Associate Director of the Strategy and Doctrine Program in RAND's Army Research Division and a member of the senior research staff at RAND. And one, I might say, that reporters, at least reporters that I know, frequently turn to when something blows up. And what does this mean? So he handles a lot of phone calls, I'm aware of. Before coming to RAND, Dr. Hoffman taught at both Oxford and the University College at Buckingham in England. He's a graduate of Oxford, where he did his doctoral research, and he holds degrees in government history and international relations. He's associate editor of Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, a journal that's published in the United States and England. Dr. Hoffman.
Right, and which Bill Colby is also a member of the editorial board. In my view, actually, the World Trade Center marks a watershed in our and in others' perceptions of America's vulnerability. Until last month's blast, terrorism was viewed very much as a problem that happened elsewhere, something that occurred in the already violent Middle East and the revolutionary-prone countries of Latin America that only occasionally spilled over into the streets of London, Paris, Madrid, more recently Bombay. The bombing, I think, shattered not only that complacency, but also America's sense of security. Whether the attack ultimately proves to be a single isolated event, or, as some have warned, the beginning of a new wave of terrorism, I think the fact remains that the bombing and the evidence that has come to light suggesting a conspiracy of possible international dimensions is the most serious terrorist incident to have occurred in this country in more than 2 decades. Although obviously the incident is still under investigation, and I can't offer anything but premature thoughts on the implications of it, what I would like to do is provide some preliminary observation on the Trade Center blast's significance, how it differs from past terrorist acts in this country, and what it possibly portends for the future. And then in the last few minutes, I'd like to offer some broad recommendations for legislative, intelligence, and policy responses. The World Trade Center bombing is significant, if for no other reason than 6 people are dead and more than 1,000 others are injured. It is the first terrorist incident to have occurred in the United States since 1986 that killed anyone. In 1986, a former Puerto Rican policeman was assassinated on that island by separatists. And except for the 1975 bombing at New York's LaGuardia Airport, which killed 11 persons and wounded 75 others, no other terrorist incident in this country in recent memory has caused as many deaths. Admittedly, as my distinguished colleagues have pointed out, the United States has endured decades of mostly isolated or sporadic campaigns of homegrown or imported terrorism. Indigenous terrorists have included both radical left-wing groups who initially arose in the 1960s opposed to the Vietnam War, later in the 1980s campaigned against the United States military involvement in Central America, and of course a variety of extremist right-wing white supremacist groups espousing a somewhat grab-bag ideology of racism, anti-Semitism, and tax resistance. Terrorists motivated by specific contentious issues in the American political arena, such as legalized abortion, animal rights, and the environment, have also carried out attacks on occasion designed to draw attention to themselves and to further their own specific agendas. And finally, individuals belonging to a variety of ethnic or emigre groups residing in the United States have used this country as a battleground, as a place in which to prosecute historical, in many cases centuries-old enmities against rival emigre or ethnic groups, dissidents or apostates within their own communities, but most often against the diplomatic representatives of the governments they oppose. Interestingly, despite some expressions of sympathy and understanding of the terrorists' goals and motivations, these same ethnic and emigre communities whom the terrorists purported to represent rarely provided explicit support of the terrorist violent actions, and indeed over time were increasingly alienated or embarrassed by them. The World Trade Center bombing, however, differs from these previous instances of domestic terrorism in a number of respects. First, our sense of immunity, no matter how illusory it may have been, has been irrevocably lost. And I say Our sense of immunity was illusory because, of course, since the mid-1980s, a variety of Middle Eastern terrorist groups have come to the United States and have attempted to carry out attacks here. In 1987, for example, a member of the Abu Nidal organization, who was a naturalized American citizen who owned a gas station in Puerto Rico, was arrested. It had been discovered that on his vacations or on his holidays going back to the homeland and the Israeli-occupied territories, he was carrying out attacks for the Abu Nidal organization. It was also discovered that he had been in the process of setting up a support network on the east coast of the United States. The fall of 1987, of course, 3 Lebanese Canadians crossed the border, were arrested in Vermont on their way to bomb a target in New York. And then really the most serious terrorist incident to date in the United States, admittedly one that was prevented, but one that could have had even more catastrophic consequences in the World Trade Center, was the apprehension of Yu Kikumura, a Japanese Red Army terrorist who was sent here on a bombing campaign to avenge the 1986 U.S. airstrike against Libya. I would argue that, despite the rapidity with which law enforcement authorities in this case, in this particular case, in the World Trade Center bombing, cracked the case, at the same time, though, law enforcement's long string of impressive successes in thwarting terrorist attacks has ended, basically. And accordingly, in some respects, our psychological defenses here have also been breached. And this is significant because the fact that terrorists were successful in carrying out this attack, putting aside that they were arrested quickly, but the fact that they were successful may possibly encourage future terrorist acts. Indeed, the perception belief prevalent amongst foreign terrorists concerning the difficulties of operating in the United States, and which many experts argue had restrained past inclinations to carry out attacks in the U.S., may arguably have eroded forever. Moreover, terrorists now have a somewhat better picture of how American law enforcement reacts and responds to terrorist events in this country, what clues it seeks and what leads are followed. Consequently, should terrorists strike here again, it's unlikely that they're going to make the same mistakes that the World Trade Center bombings did. Furthermore, despite the accused bombers' almost comical ineptitude in avoiding capture, the fact also remains that they were able to shake an entire city's, if not country's, complacency. If so-called amateurs using ordinary commercially available materials can fashion a simple bomb and cause so much damage and destruction, one shudders to think what international terrorism's genuine professionals could accomplish here. Finally, I would argue the evidence thus far revealed may only be the tip of the iceberg. The suspicious transfer of funds from an overseas bank to a joint account held by 2 of the bombers raises questions not only of foreign involvement, but perhaps direction of the operation. Moreover, the fact that since 1985, at least 2 other worshippers who attended the same mosque as the bomber, an Egyptian who in December 1985 was arrested by U.S. customs agents attempting to export 150 pounds of C4 plastic explosive to Palestinian terrorists in the occupied territories, and then in 1990, the assassination of Rabbi Meir Kahane, raises the possibility of some wider, long-term conspiracy, perhaps involving other persons both here and abroad. Indeed, the bombing stands, I think, as a timely reminder to the United States of both America's status in the world and the way we are viewed, in some cases hostilely, by others. This is already evidenced by a worldwide pattern of terrorist activity, whereby the total volume of annual terrorist events may fluctuate. One enduring feature that remains is that the United States is the favored targets of terrorists abroad. Indeed, since 1968, the United States, year in and year out, has headed the list of those countries whose nationals and property and interests are most frequently attacked by terrorists. Just to illustrate this, according to the database we maintain at RAND, 40% of the world's active terrorist groups last year at least once attacked an American target. Certainly the end of the Cold War and the ideological struggle that divided the world will have and has had no effect on this long-standing trend. Recent events like the shooting at the CIA and the World Trade Center bombing, in fact, suggest the opposite. And as the only remaining superpower, the United States, as the letter the bombers purportedly sent to the New York Times suggests, the United States may well be blamed in the future for even more of the world's ills and become the target of still more attacks. Thus, there may be both opportunity and motive for future terrorism against the United States. What can we do? Is there anything we can do? I would argue that our response needs to craft legislative, intelligence, and policy measures into the coherent and coordinated approach to countering international terrorism that the United States has always lacked. In legislative domain, I agree entirely with Senator Pressler that we have to tighten the provisions regarding the issuance of visas and strengthen our deportation laws. The ease with which Sheikh Rahman, the spiritual leader of the Jamaat al-Islamiyya, was able to enter this country on 2 separate occasions is almost laughable, except when one compares it to the difficulty the INS has had in trying to deport him. And this is an isolated case. Since 1987, the INS has been trying to deport several Palestinians living in Los Angeles who openly admit that they belong to the Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine, George Habash's group, which incidentally during the Gulf War threatened to use nuclear weapons against the United States. And the legislation just isn't strong enough to permit them to indict these people. This has been tied up in the courts for more than 5 years. We may also wish to revisit and reevaluate the constraints imposed on American law enforcement intelligence gathering that were put into place in the late 1960s, early 1970s following the revelations of COINTELPRO, civil rights, and the Watergate era. And certainly here I agree entirely. We need to balance and be very careful that we balance constitutional and civil liberties with the security and defense of the United States. But in the new world order that we live in today, I think it certainly is appropriate to revisit this legislation and see if it's still appropriate to the threats and demands of the times. Finally, and I feel very strongly in this, I would avoid embracing simplistic and possibly counterproductive responses such as the imposition of the death penalty on terrorists. First, it's never worked anywhere in stopping terrorism, but if you don't believe me, read Menachem Begin's memoir, The Revolt. In many cases, it's proved counterproductive. Also, I don't think anybody would argue that the death penalty has had a great deal of effect on deterring ordinary crime in this country, so I don't see why we should expect that it'll work against terrorists. Indeed, terrorists may well welcome this opportunity for continued sacrifice and martyrdom, and indeed welcome the opportunity that a trial and the death penalty would provide them in terms of a propaganda for their platform for their propaganda. It is also likely to encourage further attacks against the United States and to lock the United States in a tit-for-tat struggle where the terrorists do this to stop us from doing that, where we have to respond. Also, too, I think if anything could incite a new round of hostage-taking of Americans abroad, it would certainly be the death penalty issue. Finally, too, I would argue that imposition of the death penalty opens us up to somewhat of international ridicule. For 40 years, Israel has endured terrorist attacks by the Palestinians. Although there is a death penalty on their books, they have never enforced it. For more than 20 years, the British have endured terrorism from the IRA. They don't impose the death penalty. Yet, after one terrorist incident, this is our solution. In terms of intelligence, I think the open question now is whether the World Trade Center will be treated as a law enforcement or as it should as an intelligence issue. If it's a law enforcement issue, several people have been arrested, they're under indictment, they'll be tried, justice will be served, they'll go to prison, case closed. If it's an intelligence issue, however, we have to ask a number of difficult questions, which may potentially have a number of disquieting answers. For example, was this part of a broader conspiracy? Was this the inchoate start of a wider bombing campaign? Are these the only cells of part-time ad hoc terrorists in the United States? And what do their foreign connections suggest? Also, if we treat it as an intelligence matter, we may have to recognize that the World Trade Center is possibly an opening salvo in a new conflict for a new era. What we need, I think, to address this issue head-on is a top-down assessment of the terrorist threat in this new era. It must start from zero and address the array of new adversaries and new challenges facing the United States in a radically altered new world order. But only by endowing this issue with the high visibility that it requires can it succeed. I think one important first step would be to reconstitute the Vice President's Task Force on Terrorism. It was stood up in 1987 following the TWA 847 hijacking and then was stood down the following year. We need also to build actively on the international cooperation against terrorism that had emerged during the Gulf War, and indeed the tremendous amount of progress that's been made in the United Nations against Libya in the past year. Already, officials, for example, in the Office of the Secretary of Defense are thinking along these lines. Their efforts need to be supported and strengthened. Finally, too, I think terrorism research is too often conducted in a vacuum, divorced from the reality of the subject that we study. And really, I think the most serious terrorism research in the future is going to involve the actual subjects of our inquiries, the terrorists, especially in a place like Italy, where a number of terrorists have become repentant, have recanted. It's this type of information that we need. Lastly, let me just briefly discuss the policy dimension. The United States needs a clear and consistent policy on responding to terrorist attacks and provocations. And this has to be accompanied at the same time by the realization that the vast majority of terrorist incidents that occur throughout the world, although they may tragically kill Americans, destroy American property, do not directly affect our national security. By treating terrorism with equanimity and sobriety rather than emotion and sensationalism, This will permit us to marshal our resources when and where they can be the most effective. At the same time, we have to accept that no progress will be made against the terrorism that affects us the most until terrorism state sponsors are held accountable for their aid and encouragement. As this poses the greatest threat to the conduct of our foreign policy and indeed to our national security, this should be the focus of our active and proactive measures. Certainly economic measures such as the United States has been doing in Libya are an important first step. But in some cases, we may need to go further and to harness the information capabilities that we have in the United States, what some people have called cyber wars. For example, during the 1980 hostage situation in Tehran, it was found that all currency exchanges that involve two or more currencies go through New York. This gives the United States a powerful weapon in freezing other countries' resources. Military options, I would point out, are only going to succeed if they're done as part of a coherent and overarching plan. Although dramatic reprisal operations or bombings may assuage the American public's and indeed the American government's frustration, they may have negative effects if innocent civilians are killed. And here I think about the 1986 bombing of Libya. 36 civilians were killed and 93 wounded. Those deaths and injuries are no less tragic than Americans who were victimized because of the nationality of the passport they cover. Rather, we have to look at terrorism in terms of our military options and craft it to send a powerful message, not create martyrs and prove counterproductive in the long run. And here I think a lot of the non-lethal technologies that many of the United States former nuclear weapons laboratories are undertaking provides perhaps the greatest opportunity for this. Electromagnetic pulses, for instance, that would disable machinery, disrupting and jamming telecommunications, both symbolically and actually isolating a renegade country from the rest of the world, and so forth. This will have a more salutary impact on the on the level of terrorism, and also on opinion both in the United States and abroad. And in fact, it'll probably enable. I think we have to have a realistic expectation of precisely what can be accomplished in the struggle against terrorism. Some people have drawn the parallel to the war against terrorism to the war against organized crime. No one in their right minds expects we're ever going to completely eliminate organized crime in this country, but nor do we do nothing about it. And in conclusion, we have to realize that there's no simple solution to terrorism, just as there's no such thing as complete security against terrorism as well. Thank you.
Thank you. We've reached that point in the proceedings where we're supposed to mix it up a bit. Let me start with just one question to anyone that wants to take it on, and that was Bruce Hoffman's reference to the actions of those in the World Trade Center bombing as a comical ineptitude. We're familiar with the details so far. A suspect going back for the deposit on the van, allegedly bearing some evidence of explosive when he turned it in, carrying a business card of another of the suspects in his wallet, and it goes on and on. I don't know. I mean, they brought off that that bombing, allegedly brought off that bombing. I'm kind of hung up on whether it was comical ineptitude, and I wondered if anybody has any theories on that.
Well, maybe someday we will learn that there was comical ineptitude on the part of the U.S. government in the sense of letting it be leaked and capturing them without following them for several days. Maybe they were trying to do that and the story got out, but I guess the original intention, and I can't speak from inside the government, was to follow them, to observe them, and so forth. And they were forced to arrest them once the thing was printed in the newspapers. So maybe the comical ineptitude in the end, when it's all out, will be on the part of the U.S. government in pursuing them.
Some of the actions were perhaps inept, but were an attempt to be professional. The reason he hired the van and put down the deposit and then called up and said the van had been stolen and then came back to get his deposit was to show that he had nothing to do with the fact that the van blew up in the World Trade Center. It was an amateurish attempt to put up a cover story, if you will. Now, the thing was broken because there was evidence of the explosives on the papers and so forth, and once we got onto the lead of his name and identity, why then a lot of the other things unraveled. But yes, I think there was a certain amount, I wouldn't call it comic, but I would say it just plain ineptitude. These were not highly trained professionals, I don't think, and they were making it up as they went along. And it's not too hard to put a whole bundle of explosive together and put it a detonator and a timer in them. That's not the most complicated thing in the world.
Does that fact that they were not highly trained professionals say anything about whether it was state-sponsored or not?
Well, it says to me that that's one of the problems we have to concern ourselves. When you get the demagogues screaming for the blood of the great Satan, then you'll get a certain number of people who'll go out and do things to carry that out. And then the state will say, oh, well, we didn't do anything. Our hands are clean, like Pontius Pilate did.
Mm-hmm.
If I could say something, well, I was trying to be subtly facetious, but obviously I didn't succeed. But I mean, comical or not, the fact remains they still killed 6 people, and that certainly isn't comical. I think the point that I really wanted to get is that perhaps, to a certain extent, the simplicity of the attack is why it's so dangerous. Indeed, too, if you read some of the material connected with Yuki Komura's indictment and trial, what you find out is that his instructions when he was dispatched here as a state-sponsored terrorist by Libya, didn't come with plastic explosives and the types of sophisticated bombs that were sort of accustomed to seen in the Middle East and other places. But his training in the Bekaa Valley, as indeed that of other terrorists who have come to the United States from Middle Eastern countries, was precisely as the World Trade Center bombing indicates, to use ordinary commercially available materials and to fabricate bombs in that manner. And Kikomura, in fact, had embarked on an odyssey, I think, across 12 states, buying the parts to his bombs in different states to camouflage his trail. So in some respects, it may be that the sophistication is in the simplicity.
Doug, is there anything?
I'm a little bit at a loss here that I can't comment because of the investigation, but I would like to pick up on the Senator's comment, and that goes to the leaks, that in any investigation, and particularly one that is in its infancy, leaks of any type are very harmful to the investigation. And it is something that is great concern to me, and I'm sure to everybody when we look at that types of situation, because sometimes it causes law enforcement to have to act prematurely. Other times it just gets false impressions or information that's out in the public arena, or it could be the actual giving up of evidentiary material that could be damaging to the case later on.
Anybody else on that point? There was one thing that was mentioned about several times about tightening up U.S. visa provisions. My question is whether it's really necessary to change the provisions or merely the enforcement. I thought the provisions were there, and that it was simply that there hasn't been enough person power attached to them and enough computer power as well.
I think that is true. I think the enforcement, of course, it costs money. We'll have to provide that money, and I think that all these things that we have to be honest with people. If we do have more rules on coming in and out of the country, it both costs money and it's an inconvenience to people who are businessmen or otherwise moving who get into a snag somewhere. But I think even with the tightening up, we also could have some new pieces of legislation. Al Simpson tried a first step at that, but it was voted down. It's very hard. There are a lot of forces that our country really likes to have our citizens be able to come in and go out of the country quickly and easily and so forth. And that has been a tradition, and we've been going to looser regulations. I know the tourism industry seeks almost a visa-free situation with many countries, with as many countries as possible, to promote trade and tourism, to help the balance of payments and so forth. So we have a number of contradictory forces working here, and we have to decide what we want.
Anyone else find anything outrageous or anything they want to disagree with at this point?
The comment that I would have, again, to agree with the senator that while I think it goes a little bit beyond the manpower that is connected with INS. There are some of the regulations and the handling and the way an individual coming here can claim certain things, and then the procedures that exist in order to, look at that individual, how they can disappear into society without us being able to track them, to determine if everything is legitimate or the appropriate checks. When I say us track them, I don't mean the FBI, but I mean the appropriate agency in there. And I think that whole process needs to be looked at in order to see that people with bona fide reasons and legitimate reasons are treated the way they should be without somebody using those just to get themselves in and disappear within our society.
Yes, the height of that is the people who consume or destroy their documents on the plane, and when they arrive at the airport in New York, they declare themselves to be political refugees or something such, and we give them a work permit or something, or a visitor's visa, and they can disappear completely into our society. I think 60 Minutes had a feature on this the other night, and in my judgment that should be changed in our law.
If the observation is correct that the one thing that distinguishes the recent terrorism from some earlier examples is that it may be tied to fundamentalism, tied to religion in some way, does this change the ballgame at all for the United States? I mean, is the United States less equipped to deal with that than it is state-sponsored, pure secular terrorism?
I would say no. You say, well, don't you run into the protection of freedom of religion? No, you don't when you've got inspirational work to specific abuse. You can punish that. You can't punish a complaint against the unfairness of the world and the fact that the United States is rich and I'm so poor. That it's hard to punish, that kind of a statement, but you can punish a specific incitement to crime, to violence and that sort of thing. But I'm not sure that any of these particular improvements will change everything for us, because this is so open a country that you just couldn't conceive this country working on a tightly controlled basis. It wouldn't work at all. And the difference between our present loopholes, which they are, there are millions of them, and a tightly controlled society is something that the American people not only would not, but could not achieve, I don't think. So I think the matter is to turn to your authorities, put the heat on them, and I'm sure the senator will from time to time. That's his function, and he does a good job of it, to find any malfeasance or misfeasance involved in it. But not think that there's some little wonderful key that's going to change everything if we just pass a new law. That's not where it's going to happen. It's going to happen in good, solid police and intelligence work against these kinds of threats, at home and abroad.
The comment I would have, Mr. Osterley, is that it was raised before about the necessity perhaps for additional laws in this type of, in improving there or relaxing of certain restrictions. Right now we operate basically in two arenas. For looking at international terrorism, we apply with our basically classified guidelines and use the FISA court, the foreign court, to utilize the techniques there that are available and court-approved instruments. And for the domestic terrorism, we apply our criminal laws and through the criminal court in looking at. So we have really, as I said, a bifurcated approach, and we can apply either in either instance depending on what the nature of the violation is. But we can conduct intelligence types of investigations, and then when there is a criminal violation, we can apply the criminal law to it. And from the FBI's perspective, that we are very comfortable with the mechanisms that are set up and the oversight that we do have, because we feel that we have to be responsive to the citizens and to the oversight committees, and that we can justify to them that we are operating with the framework of the Constitution and are cognizant of individuals' rights and are aware of the First Amendment rights, et cetera, that exist out there without getting overly restrictive in our approach to this. And I think, you know, the demonstration in that is, well, again, you know, what I'm saying is that, and one criticism I recognize it's come up in the World Trade Center is, why didn't we know anything about this before it occurred? In that, the simple truth is, with as many individuals that are in this country, you know, we don't have the ability to, you know, monitor everybody. And in order for us to have an investigation on an individual, it has to rise to a certain threshold with indications that laws are going to be violated or acts are going to occur, and then we can institute either under the criminal or the intelligence side and take a look at that. So I think that, you know, we have a procedure that is protective of the citizens, but yet one that gives us a good degree of protection in trying to address these. And the point I was trying to make before is that you alluded to the numbers of preventions of acts that have actually been stopped before they occurred. And I think actually you mentioned the number 40. I think it's up closer to 70 in that time frame that you were talking about.
There is one area that is in this morning's paper, that the United States has said that the Iranians are stimulating international terrorism. And they are. They're supporting terrorist training camps in Lebanon and in Sudan, aimed at stimulating terrorism in Egypt, in Algeria, various other places, Tunisia. And we have said they should be under sanction until they stop doing that. And so we had a sanction for a while, no loans from the IMF. Well, yesterday, all the other nations in the IMF agreed to extend a loan to Iran, despite the fact that they are engaged in this activity, and we have good coverage of the fact that they're doing it. Now, we're a minority in the voting members of the IMF, so that our good allies, who are also affected by terrorism, have decided that it's more important to lend some money to Iran than to continue to make this point. I find that fairly outrageous. And I think our good allies ought to be told that we think it's fairly outrageous.
And I would add just one more. I join in those remarks of Mr. Colby. And I would just add one more remark here, that I think we're probably in sort of a lucky period right now where we don't have as many of these other countries advocating terrorism against us as we do at certain times. I think that what Mr. Colby said about the steady work of the countries, of the various countries, some progress has been made. But it always amazes me how other countries can blame the United States for everything that happens. And when I travel abroad, I'm always amazed at how much people like our music and our culture and our movies, but in official discussions, people always think whatever problems they have arise because of the United States somehow, or they want foreign aid from us. Those are the two things.
How much they'd like a visa.
And how much they'd like a visa. But, and I was fascinated with my friend from Iran's comments that we are still in a period where terrorism is very much something that is very much with us, which it is, but it's my feeling that we're in kind of a lucky period. It could get a lot tougher with the development of certain things in the international arena. The end of the Cold War and the period of relative peace that we have, if we have the states of the old Soviet Union go back to fundamental communism, I think we could have a much worse era of terrorism coming up in the future.
One other point, if I could make, in looking at this problem of terrorism, you know, I feel it really needs to be looked at in a global context. It's not a United States problem or a United Kingdom problem. And it's one that, you know, really requires, you know, the coordination and cooperation of the allied nations in looking, you know, at particular groups and what they're doing and sharing of that intelligence in order to address the problem. And that's a very necessary ingredient and factor in there.
Mm-hmm. I think we've reached the point where we'll throw it open to some questions, I hope sharp questions that'll get it going here. There's a microphone there if you would be kind enough to use that. Please.
I was struck by the comment made by Mr. Colby, which is very pertinent. My name is Joseph Polikoff. I write for Jewish newspapers. And the argument that could be made is that we are alone, as the story this morning reported, in saying to the world, we don't want to lend any money to Iran. And was it 23 other nations said, we will. And it seems to be, if it's perhaps cynical, and what I would like to hear a comment, isn't it possible that this is a buyout? The countries say, you can bomb the United States, don't trouble us, we'll help you. Therefore, there must be something more that could be done. You see, Mr. Colby said it was outrageous and we should tell our allies, but will we? And if we don't, what happens?
Well, I think we can tell them, and I think we're in the process of coming up to tell them, but you're right that some of the others just haven't the same degree of interest because they don't feel threatened, although they have their own terrorist threats. There are certain parts of Paris that I defy you to walk safely through, and there are terrorists in Paris that are blowing things up and so forth. No question about it. And what it requires is an alliance of the countries that are affected. But Britain, for instance, is very unhappy that the United States has been less than effective in holding down the support that comes to the IRA from various bars in New York and Boston. Is that a form of support of terrorism? And are we letting it happen and ignoring it? A lot of people have been hurt in Britain because of the IRA. So it's a matter of gathering together the kind of alliance against this kind of a problem that we eventually did against communism and succeeded, and I think we could do it against these kinds of terrorist actions. It would take a lot of diplomatic work and a lot of detailed work on the intelligence and security side.
But I would just comment on that. I think that you're absolutely right. I think they do say if the U.S. gets bombed, that's their problem, and they just go ahead and give the loans to Iran. It's the same thing in dealing with Yugoslavia. Everybody expects us to do it. Germany made a lot of noise when they said recognize Bosnia and so forth a year ago, and then when the going gets tough, they're not there. The European nations, those who voted on giving the money to Iran, I think that had to be what they said, was that this is the United States problem, and we're not really worried about it, and it disappointed me.
I think it really comes down to a question of political will, and in certain cases, I don't think we face up to that. The United States has indeed embraced the moniker itself as the sole remaining superpower in the world, and we believe, I think, that by engaging in humanitarian relief, providing assistance, that we'll be viewed impartially by other people and viewed as the good guys, and that's not, in many cases, that just doesn't work out quite that way. And we live, I think, a little bit under an illusion. That's one problem, so we don't anticipate threats. And even when the threats sort of slap us in the face, in January, for example, the Israelis were warning the United States that there was in the United States a command and control apparatus, or at least an active cell of Muslim fundamentalist terrorists. And all of us, and myself included in interviews, said, no, I'm sure that there's fundraising activity, there's, types of things going on in the mosque, but there's no terrorism. But we willingly ignored that. We didn't want to believe that it would be in this country. So it's when a lot of countries sort of ignore what's in front of them, and when on top of that there's no common perception of the threat, that one man's terrorist is viewed as something a little bit more palatable to other countries, it's very difficult to have any sort of a common or united front to stop terrorism.
Yes, please.
David Briscoe from Associated Press. I'd like to ask Mr. Gao and any other panel member who might respond, to what extent do we consider terrorist groups supported by Iran a threat to the United States right now for the future? And did the action of the United States voting solely against the latest loan, I believe it was the World Bank or the IMF or whatever it was, does that make us more vulnerable to Iran than before? Does it make Iran to these types of groups?
Maybe I can answer that from our perspective in kind of a general term about in looking at the Islamic fundamentalism and that whole growth in the area. When we get into those particular groups that we know are sponsored by the state sponsors or those who have sponsored terrorism in the past, naturally they are of concern to us. And that's where it comes in as far as the coordination between our allied countries and looking at what in trying to define what the threat is. You know, we have said publicly here that we have the infrastructure of many of those groups that are existing within this country. And therefore, you know, absent a predicate to initiate an investigation or to monitor, you know, specific activities that would rise to the standard that we could institute investigations, you know, our hands are tied and they are free to do what they want within the United States. But, you know, with you know, a variety of things, political initiatives such as is going on in Yugoslavia and with the Mideast peace process, you know, that does cause concern that we may become a target because we are seen as an ally of Israel. And in some respects, as it's already been mentioned, because, you know, we think that we go in with humanitarian aid, that it places us in a certain respect, but that it may cause people to take action against us for their seeing us as failure to take harder action, or, you know, not becoming involved up to their liking. So what I'm saying is that, you know, based on intelligence information that comes from a variety of sources, we have to assess the nature of the threat, and then be you know, cognizant of it and do what we can to monitor it and take action if it raises to a level where we can institute investigations.
Well, so far as Iran goes, I think for more than a decade we've sort of searched for the holy grail of finding moderates and pragmatists in Iran and then hoped that the terrorism problem would go away. And indeed, I think there was a collective sigh of relief breathed when the last American hostages were freed from Lebanon, and we thought the problem had been solved. But in fact, over the past few years, Iran has merely shifted its locus from Lebanon to Sudan, where, at least according to the unclassified intelligence reports I've seen, there's somewhere between a dozen and 20 terrorist training camps. The Egyptians claim that the problems that they're having with Jamaat al-Islamiyah, the group that's Sheikh Rahman is the spiritual head, emanate from Sudan. The bombing of the Israeli embassy last year in Buenos Aires demonstrates that Iran is still very much in the terrorist business.
Does anyone want to take a crack at, before we go to the next question, just as a follow-on to this, whether the U.S. should think seriously, assuming something is established here that it's state-sponsored, of the kind of response we had with Libya during the Reagan administration? I mean, was that an effective response as far as terrorism went?
It certainly discouraged the Libyans for a while.
Mm-hmm. I have to disagree with that, actually. I think that the bombing made Americans feel good, but had absolutely no effect on Libya's sponsorship of international terrorism. They continued to do so in succeeding years, and in fact, it made the problem worse. They sent Yuki Komura to the United States on a bombing mission. I think that really economic sanctions, as is squeezing Libya right now, are the most effective response, and then more cleverly applied military responses than just the resort to so-called surgical smart weapons.
Look at the Libyan thing. The bombing in Berlin was identified by some intercept work, some very precise police work, and it became absolutely crystal clear where that order to do that bombing came from, and that was the basis for the retaliation. Just as with Pan Am 103, the most meticulous and painstaking kind of assembly of evidence over a year and a half or more finally enabled us to know that two guys did it, and they're in the Libyan service. And we've been hung up on our relations with Libya ever since because of that. Now, here's the combination of what you can do with good intelligence and security work, and then it's a question of what you can do with sanctions, diplomacy, and all the rest of it, or even retaliation. Now, that's a policy question as to where you want to stop on the ladder going up at a certain point. But the discussion today of oil sanctions on Libya, not very popular in Europe at the moment because it'll raise the price of oil. Oh, horrors. So we're not able to get our allies to do it. Now that bespeaks a difficulty in the relationship between countries in a fairly benign atmosphere worldwide in comparison to the days of the Cold War where everybody was threatened. This kind of terrorism threatens a few odds and ends of people here and there, but the governments do not feel terribly threatened and consequently willing to take sacrifices major sacrifices in order to bring it to heel.
Yes, please.
Yes. Frederick Allen Maxwell, independent. And first I'd like to thank the group and my doctors and nurses and technicians at Georgetown University, and my stitched and battered body would agree that domestic terrorism is our greatest problem. For Mr. Colby, in 1974, a book was published by John Marks and Victor, I don't pronounce his name, Marchetti, called The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence. A couple months ago, there was obviously a shooting at the CIA. Two questions. One, do you think it was just by chance that the person we're pretty sure did the shooting happened to be employed by Marchetti's son's career business? And I'll follow up.
I think that's coincidence, yes. I wouldn't blame Victor or even his son for planning this operation against CIA.
Okay. And second, do you think there's any relationship whatsoever between the shooting at the CIA and the World Trade Center bombing?
Only in the general sense that here was a fellow who's Islamic who wants to protest against the Western world, if you will, and the ones in New York obviously took a major symbol of American financial power and made a blow against it. They may well have made a trip down to Washington and decided that our public buildings are too well defended. You can't run a car freely into the garage under the House of Representatives or the Senate or the Supreme Court or the White House. It's tough because we have taken the lesson of protecting these public buildings, but here a garage was left open and people are allowed to go freely into it without as much as a question, I gather, and a very symbolic target. Similarly, the CIA, for a lot of the world, is a symbolic target. I mean, there's all the myths about CIA, some of them put out by Marchetti's book and others, that somehow CIA is the nexus of all evil in the world. This creates an incentive by some frustrated people to strike a blow at it. And his system of striking a blow was to find the left turn lane at the morning drive into the agency and just shoot 4 or 5, whatever it was, people there. Just totally random. He was making a blow against CIA, I suspect. I don't think we know this for sure yet. We haven't found him, but I assure you there are a lot of people wandering all over northern Pakistan looking for him right now. And they'll find him. I guarantee you they'll find him.
Please.
Hello. Last week at the Middle East Institute, Peter Bechtold gave a speech in which he's a Sudanese expert at the Foreign Service Institute. He gave a speech in which he said that there was no evidence whatsoever that there were actually Iranian training camps in Sudan, and he was very doubtful that these training camps actually existed. But yet Mr. Colby and Mr. Hoffman have both mentioned these camps. I'm wondering if there's any evidence for these camps except for the statements of the Egyptian government. Thank you.
As I understand it, that is our intelligence conclusion from the all-source look at the problem. Now, I don't know the origins of these specific items of information, but all I've seen is the general summaries that you have that sort of say that, yes, there are some camps there. I don't know the number 20. Maybe you have a basis for that, but I don't know that at all.
Well, of course, I'm speaking from the unclassified reports I've seen, and they may be repeating the same fiction, but even if the issue of the camps is debatable or unproven, the fact remains that Iran and Sudan have very close political and economic ties. Iran, for example, underwrote a several $million purchase of jet fighters from China for the Sudanese. Apparently I think this is documented, that Iranian trainers have been assisting the Sudanese army in the suppression of the Sudan People's Liberation Army in the south. So there's a lot of Iranian activity. Whether it's terrorist training camps or not specifically, it doesn't surprise me, and that's why I put some credence in these unclassified reports.
Mr. Bechtold stated that the Iranian-Sudanese relations were actually very poor right now, and that the Iranian ambassador in Sudan was having a lot of problems with the Sudanese government in terms of just trying to get along with him. He said, for example, there's no Iranian oil being sent to Sudan, as it's been reported, and that while perhaps Iran has bought some arms, these are of small nature and not anything of significance. I mean, I just wondering if there's any hard evidence, or most of what this information is coming from the Egyptian government, which of course has its own agenda for fighting against the Sudanese government.
And again, from unclassified sources, in November and December, the New York Times and the Washington Post, and particularly the New York Times' reporter Yusuf Ibrahim, had a series of articles on this that seemed very convincing to me. Now, that may be the case more recently, that there's been some fracture or disruption in their relations, but as I said, the press accounts that I've seen, which struck me as fairly convincing and not sensational, pointed very much to rather tighter relations. But I don't know.
A training camp isn't a big deal. I mean, it's a barracks someplace with a place to shoot weapons behind it. I mean, that's about all you need. You don't need a great large installation or anything. And so I have no idea about these, but you can train a terrorist in a back room if you need to.
I mean, even circumstantially, for more than 20 years, there's been an insurrection in the South Sudan that the Sudanese forces on their own had been unable to make any headway against. It seems that the convergence of reports of increased Iranian military advisors and trainers coming, their Revolutionary Guards, and the fact that an important turning point has been made in that struggle with the defeat of the Sudan People's Liberation Army suggests that a reasonable amount of activity.
Actually, Mr. Bechtol's point was quite the opposite. He said that the terrain in Iran is so different from southern Sudan, there's no possible way Iranian trainers could have helped the Sudanese at all in this matter. Because as you know, southern Sudan is it's very tropical, not like the desert expanse in Iran. So his point was that, actually he said that the Iranian trainers had gone there and returned to Iran, and said there's no way that we could in any way influence this war. But my main point is, I mean, where is the information coming from these training camps? Is it, as you mentioned, unclassified reports and the media reports? Is there anything more hard than this, any harder evidence that there's actually Iranian support for the Sudanese government? Or is it mostly just media reports and information, propaganda from different governments and things like that?
Well, I've had it referred to, seen it referred to in the press as intelligence assessments, and the summaries are that. And that would have meant to me that the analytical side of the agency had put together this overall compilation of all sorts of bits and pieces and come to the conclusion that there was some training going on there. The fact, a training can be a very small group of people who come and train people to train. They don't necessarily have to train the final people involved at all. They can be as kind of a string. The Iranians in the Bekaa Valley weren't down there along the coast doing the operations. They were doing the training up in the valley in Lebanon.
Yes, please.
This is a question for all of you. What steps, if any, can the INS take to stop the entry of terrorists or illegals into the country? This has been documented recently on 60 Minutes and other reports, and I'm interested in you elaborating on this point.
Before anybody responds, I must say, from covering the Justice Department for nearly 30 years, I'm struck with every Attorney General, just as they're leaving, said that the thing I didn't pay attention to enough was the INS. We really should have done something about the INS. And these aren't just Republicans, or these are everybody, every Attorney General. So I have the same question.
Well, one Attorney General said we'd lost control of our frontiers.
Right. Right. Is there any suggestion of what might be done with regard in staying within the parameters of civil liberties, and give us your homeless, your poor, your tired, and all of that? What can be done?
My impression is just more administrative muscle, more resources, a larger budget, and perhaps more inspectors. I mean, that's not a complete solution to the problem. That's not going to staunch the flow of terrorists, such as it is, or if it is, into the United States. But I think, given that there's something like 25 million tourists that come into the United States each year, and approximately 500,000 stay on, I mean, you're talking about really a problem of Herculean proportions, but an understaffed and underfinanced INS can't do very much of anything without a larger budget and more administrative muscle.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Well, who's, if I may follow up, how could one initiate the priority of cracking down? Does this have to come through Congress or administratively, or why hasn't these steps been taken previously?
Mr. Gao referred to the real answer, which was the contribution, the help you can get from the citizen. You all remember the old story about Kitty Genovese in New York, who was murdered while 37 people watched and did nothing. And yet the son of Sam was picked up, who had terrorized half the women in New York, because somebody noticed something funny about his car and reported it to the police, and they began to look at him. I mean, that's your basic answer to your terrorist. If you have substantial suspicions, Mr. Gao would be delighted to talk to you. And he gets 50 crazy stories a day, I'm sure. But he goes through all 50 of them in order to get the 51st.
There is one other point that I would make without getting into detail here is that there are initiatives currently underway in government right now looking at the very question that you've asked.
You know, just thinking a minute about the alert citizenry, the two cases that you cited of recent close calls on terrorism, the Japanese Red Army fellow and the two men coming over from Canada through Vermont, those were both, as I recall, solved or alerted, responded to by local police. One was a state trooper, I think, on the Japanese Red Army one. Saw him on a stop there, and something was suspicious about what he saw. And the other one was a lone police chief in a small Vermont town that saw these guys with a bag, and it looked suspicious to him, and he followed up on it. I mean, you can't always count on there's going to be the state trooper and the police chief is the problem. But at any rate, I'm sorry, I cut you off.
I'm Jacqueline Rose. I'm a National Press Club member. Mr. Colby mentioned a slip to the press or by the press, publishing some things regarding the suspects on the World Trade Center bombing, which
I don't think I did. I think Mr.
Mr. Hoffman.
Mr. Goddard, did you?
I might have misunderstood. I was about to say I thought I heard, if I heard correctly.
It was the senator. It was the senator.
If I heard correctly,
you're right.
Some allusion was made. I didn't mean to put words in anyone's mouth here. Makes me wonder, since suggestions have been made what we can do to thwart terrorism, since you're addressing a National Press Club, could you, and National Press Foundation, can you make any suggestions as to how the press could aid so that we wouldn't have to arrest someone prematurely in the future?
I have long learned not to tell the press how to do their business.
Is that one you want to?
Oh, I think I'll
just rest with that. Yeah, I'm not sure it's established yet. I don't really know the fact that it was premature because of that something appeared in Newsday. I don't know that that's factual or not. That's certainly the story that's been published. I don't know.
If you have a very good reason for keeping something back, and you explain the reason to the reporter who comes to you all breathing hot about it, your chances of getting him to hold it are pretty good. I've had that happen in a couple of cases.
Yes.
My name is Jeffrey Winograd. I edit a newsletter called Focus Israel, and I believe it was Dr. Hoffman who mentioned the subject of coordination, or someone up here, it was actually Mr. Gao, mentioned the subject of coordination. I was writing down a list of things where I can talk to you about giving examples of where one agency perhaps didn't coordinate with another agency. For example, on the Hill there's a perception among some journalists that the Sheikh was given his first or second visa because of a payoff to the CIA for certain other activities. And we can go on and on and on. I can cite examples of the Justice Department not wanting to refer something to the FBI that was related to the Middle East. Question is, specific comments, recommendations, how do we coordinate interagency, And at the same time, is there a certain institutional reason for lack of coordination? And a follow-up would be when the executive agencies come to testify or give briefings, are you basically co-opting congressmen and senators by giving them classified briefings, and then they can't ask certain questions when it comes to public hearings on the same subjects?
No, I don't think so. I think that the different agencies work together really quite well. I won't say perfectly. Obviously, there are glitches. The most interesting one recently was the CIA finding some information about that BNL bank down in Atlanta and reporting it to the State Department and the Treasury, but not realizing that it's the Fed that controls banks. So they never reported it to the Fed. I mean, it wasn't a conscious leaving them out, but the Fed is not a normal recipient of intelligence from CIA. So that here we missed one, clearly missed, and it's wrong. I'm sure they'll report to the Fed from now on if they run into anything about banks. But no, the community works together quite well. As for letting somebody in because he did a favor for CIA, that would have had to been worked out with the Justice Department to let him come in. I mean, and I don't know of any basis for that in the Sheik's situation. It's a favorite thing for anybody in trouble to say, oh, I was working for CIA. That's the greatest dodge around and has been used for years. And finally, the Congress put sort of a stop to it by saying the judge could determine whether what he was saying was really relevant to the case he had, and if it was not, why then the judge could say, well, no, then that won't block it. But that took a law about 5, 6 years ago.
I would just like to correct one thing. Mr. Colby is one of my heroes in the intelligence arena, but in BCCI, agency did, share with us. So there was that did exist.
No, with the FBI, yeah, but not with the Federal Reserve.
Oh, no.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't explain that. I meant the Federal Reserve.
But there are a number of mechanisms that exist within government for the sharing of information, and these things, there are committees, there are bilateral relationships, and it works very well. And the working relationships do exist, and everybody is working towards a common aim here. So I wouldn't want to leave the impression that we have some mechanism within the government or a basis, for a lack of coordination, because that's simply not true.
As for the co-opting of the committees, I mean, obviously, if you're subject to control by a committee, you're going to wag your tail and put your best foot forward. I mean, that's a normal relationship, but they also handle some critical events, and particularly after the event happens, the congressmen and senators are apt to be very critical indeed. It may be behind closed doors in executive session, where they lay out all the facts, and they, if necessary, take somebody to the woodshed. There's no question about it. But as for co-opting them, I don't think so. I think the congressmen figure they have their own responsibilities.
If I could mention just one other, as a classic example of a coordination between intelligence and law enforcement, both from the national and in the international perspective, I would refer you to the Pan Am 103 investigation. And in that, you had an investigation that basically went 3 years before indictments were returned, and involving a number of entities worldwide with problems of overcoming differences in law, the handling of evidence and collection of evidence, and integrating the intelligence community into the law enforcement function. And it was one that was just, I think, when the full facts someday can be played out after we get to court, and if we ever do, it's just an outstanding example, and really one that set the precedent for those types of investigations, because I know of no investigation in the international arena that lasted that long and went on for that length of time.
Well, from being outside of the government, I can, observe this from a distance. And from what I've seen, I think the interagency coordination is in fact quite good. Like any bureaucracy, especially multiple ones, things are going to fall through the cracks. But at RAND, we recently concluded a study that was commissioned by the National Institute of Justice to precisely survey federal, state, and local law enforcement cooperation on the issue of terrorism. And I think, like most people, we were predisposed to find out that there was great rivalry or enmity between the FBI and the local people, and that wasn't the case at all. And in fact, what we found is that the 14 joint terrorism task forces that this is 14, isn't it? That the FBI has set up throughout the country and cities did an excellent job of coordination. And on the larger, let's say, intelligence level, there is now an interagency coordinating terrorism group that functions. My point earlier in talking about how this is an issue that requires high-level visibility and support, and that's why I suggested the reconstitution of the Vice President's Task Force on Terrorism, is to give it that extra strength and that extra priority, to take it from the sort of tactical or worker level and really give it the high policy priority it deserves.
I'll follow up by an example. A member of Congress in a public statement in a hearing about 2 years ago linked a purchaser of First American Bank stock to Hezbollah. And this took place in hearings, as I say, approximately 2 years ago. In that kind of situation, could we be assured that, for example, CIA, FBI, or National Security Agency would have coordinated something along the way if they picked up a piece of information? Would that have been relevant to interagency coordination?
I don't remember the incident, I'm afraid. It's a little hard to talk about it. If the government put it out, I would say that it's probably been checked out through the different other agencies. It'd be my guess, if there were an official statement. If there were a leak of something, you have no idea at what level the leak took place and how far in the coordinating process the thing was when it actually leaked, which is sometimes a problem.
Any other?
Warren Rogers, Associated Features. I think I'm hearing a kind of a hopelessness about this whole prospect of terrorism. It reminds me of when hostage-taking was in vogue. There seems to be a helplessness about it. There's no way, is there no way to preempt? Is there no way to avoid acts of terrorism such as we saw in New York before they take place? Is there no way to improve the international network so that we know some of these things are coming? Or do we have to sit back and let them happen and then react to horror?
I think we have preempted a certain number. The number 70, I think you corrected my figure of 40. Are you going to eliminate it forever from any situation? Maybe not. But are you going to substantially reduce the threat? The Italians did. The Germans did. We can. No question about it. It just takes good, hard work. It's police work, it's intelligence work, and it's political will and cooperation among nations. But yes, it can be slowed down, and as I say, if it really gets serious so that the normal citizen is really very frightened, then I guarantee you something will happen.
Do these things have a kind of a vogue to them? Do we go through a period of hostage-taking and then we stop that for a while and the terrorist organizations now take to bombing the large cities and that sort of thing? Is that what we're witnessing?
Well, they held all those hostages in Lebanon for years and years. They murdered a couple of them, but eventually they had to let them go. And they're not having hostages taken there now.
All right. Just a couple of points. I think I would take issue with your characterizing it as a hopeless situation. While there can't be any guarantees given to you or anybody to say that we're absolutely going to be able to interdict or we should be able to be on top of every incident that occurs, that certainly can't be. I think, from my perspective, and I hope it's just because I am in the law enforcement side, I do feel that we do have an effective, viable program. Yes, it can be improved on. We are working towards improving all the time, relationships, coordination, looking at do we need, revamping of laws and this type of thing, and having those discussions with the Justice Department. And there are people interested in that, improving our databases and our capabilities through technology, et cetera. And as Mr. Colby has said, I can point to the numbers of preventions that we've had. I think that speaks, to the good of the program. the international, coming together has been strengthening and strengthening all along the time, and this concept of looking at it in a global context. You talk about the hostage taking. If you look at the statistics again of these incidents, you'll find that probably those involving Americans, more took place in Latin America than it took place in any other portion of the world. And yes, hostage taking and abductions to a degree, have been increased. When you look at bombings, the use of a bomb has always been, so to speak, the favorite tactic of the terrorist, or the use that he applies. But I wouldn't want to, hopelessness. I think is too strong a word. And I would, challenge that.
Is there any way? Excuse me.
No, I would say, I think it's a type of warfare that's perfectly suited to modern times. And then we'll probably see more of it. I don't know if it's so much a matter of hopelessness as the fact that it's something we're going to have to learn to live with. And I'd go back to the point that I made at the end of my talk about comparing it to organized crime. I mean, certainly we can do all the things that Mr. Gow and Mr. Colby said, and that's absolutely right. That it will have a salutary and positive effect. But we've been fighting against organized crime in this country for 70 years or so, and we still haven't completely eliminated, nor will we be able to eliminate terrorism, certainly internationally, because of the, I think, idiosyncratic combination of causes that motivate it. And even in the country, we have, I think, largely because of the FBI, an excellent record in the small number of politically motivated crimes here. But nonetheless, there are still new groups arise motivated by new causes, using new tactics that they think they can get away with. So there's not one solution, nor is there permanent total security. Will that ever be possible?
As it is a global problem, and as we are the primary target, apparently, of terrorism, because we are the only superpower left, is it possible to improve the network of information so that we know these things are coming before they hit? Or do we have to work on a bilateral basis with the countries that may pick up information?
No, we work on a bilateral basis, and we work unilaterally. I can assure you we're trying to penetrate some of these gangs. No question about it. I don't know any particular cases these days, but I'm sure that's a part of the charter. If you can get a guy in the Hezbollah that will tell you what they're doing, you're going to do it.
I think our policies and a lot of our procedures now are quite sound, but just like no security manager is ever happy with and believes that he has complete security and views the problem as being a dynamic one, so the responses have to be. We should never just be content and complacent that what's in place now is effective, because that's the power of terrorism. One spectacular, we're almost back to square one.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you had a question. Oh, good.
I would like to ask just a general question, and forgive me, I've come in a bit late, so if you've covered this before, forgive me. But kind of the impact of technology on not only terrorists and the ease with which one can terrorize, but also the impact of technology on nabbing the terrorists. If you could speak to that influence, I'd appreciate it.
Well, I guess I could couch it in these terms, because the thing that I'm always afraid of in talking about what techniques and methods we employ, the game is hard enough without giving away to the other side the things that aren't going on. But this is an area that is constantly being looked at, to improve the way that we do business, if you want to put it in those terms. Information handling and the collection and analysis of intelligence, interacting with other people, how can we do it better, and what methods can we employ? And that's a constant thing that is ongoing all the time.
What about the terrorists themselves? I mean, has newfangled gizmos or made it any cheaper or easier for one to really have a big impact on?
Well, I think you can just point with what I can say about the current situation that it doesn't take much in order to get a bang for your buck, if I can put it in that context. Materials, anybody, those of us who've been in the military and had any EOD types of training, you know how easy it is, or what you can bring materials together to create, a bomb or an explosive device. And this is certainly known, this is basic to, most of your hardcore terrorist groups.
I think if anything, technology is helping us. I mean, you take a look at the Magnum monitors, you take things like that. Now, granted, some smart apples develop a weapon that is in plastic rather than in metal, so it theoretically goes through, and then you do something to it to make sure that you catch that too. And somebody developed this Semtex, this odorless explosive, and now we're trying to figure out ways to get the Semtex impregnated by all the countries that produce it. For a while during the Cold War, Czechoslovakia was selling Semtex all over the Middle East, and it was a major threat for us. And when President Havel took over, he was horrified at what they've been doing, and sort of said, no more of that stuff. But the technology, I think, if anything, probably helps us rather than the terrorist, who normally operates at a fairly low level of sophistication. Maybe clever, but not necessarily a high-tech sophistication. The hackers are terrorists in a way. I mean, let's face it.
And corporate terrorism.
Yeah, and we're having to develop defenses against those. And we are developing, and you can get a program that you run through your machine and takes out Jassy.
Well, who's winning the war on corporate terrorism?
Oh, I think business as a whole is winning it. You don't see very much. There's a cost to security, to corporate security now, but I think in general our companies are able to work. We have a little thievery of our technology goes on, but we also catch some of those and put them in jail. So it's the same kind of a contest between the person who will violate the laws and the other who will try to enforce the laws, and that's been going on for a long, long time.
Anyone else with a... please.
Yeah, I have two questions. First one would be directed at Mr. Gao, and that would be what types of incentives are there for citizens who are reporting on things that they might see regarding terrorism? Meaning afterwards, beforehand, is there anything?
When you mean incentives, are you talking about like types of rewards?
Rewards, whatever that might be. It could be cutting on the line to get the tour. I don't know. I mean, but
I think one that we try to appeal to is just the precepts of being what's required of you as a citizen. In some instances, yes, there are rewards offered for information or that type of thing along the line, whether it's government or a private institution that's offering those. But I think we try to appeal to the individual's patriotic duty. Those things are incumbent on being a citizen, being involved, being willing to come forward with information and not being afraid to, as I use the example, a lot of people are hesitant, they just don't know where to go. And then they think they feel foolish because, I've seen this. And as I said before, I could give you a lot of examples, especially in the criminal side. But the individual sometimes doesn't realize that is the key that they have, because in law enforcement and in investigating any of these, whether it be a terrorist incident or another criminal act, we need information in order to proceed with the investigation. So the key is obtaining that information, whether it be through a forensic examination or an individual coming forward and saying that.
Has the Bureau thought of maybe advertising the fact that there are these, that we as citizens should be doing these things, maybe through the media?
Well,
through the press?
think, no, not advertising, but we have, in our speeches that our agents in charge of our field officers around the country, and in that type of forum. And we do have in the intelligence arena, we have a program that we refer to as the Development of Espionage and Counterintelligence Awareness. It's referred to as DECA, which we provide to the classified industry and other people dealing with foreign governments that may be a threat or in that milieu. And that is covered in there, alerting them to be cognizant of certain things, and if they, see those factors, to report it back to us and where to report it. If it isn't to us, what the respective agency would be.
FBI does have a rather limited advertising program in the front rooms of the post offices.
Yeah, that's right. Second question I had, this would be addressed to the whole panel, would be regarding U.S. relations with countries supporting terrorism. I think that could go into two categories. One would be like Iran, and maybe Libya that the United States has made very, very clear through its relations that it does not approve. What about countries like Syria and maybe Lebanon or possibly Saudi Arabia that are either allowing these training camps to go on in their terrain or are supporting it financially?
We have a law that requires the State Department to rate different countries around the world, and maybe it's all of them, and to identify countries which are supporting terrorism each year. That new list comes out roughly every year. And if you end up on that list, you are not entitled to American assistance. I don't think you're entitled to most favored nation treatment. You certainly aren't entitled to arms exports. I don't know how much more serious the embargo gets, but then it's a grade, it's a way of highlighting that certain countries are doing things that our government feels are just plain wrong. And that we do take certain steps. I can't give you the details of what the steps are, but there are real sanctions. Just as the senator said, his amendment said that it suspended our military aid with Pakistan because they have not satisfied us that they're not building a nuclear weapon. And so we said, thank you, we're not going to continue to provide military assistance.
Well, if no one has further questions, on behalf of the National Press Foundation, National Press Club seminar on new trends in terrorism, I thank you for your questions and attendance, and I thank particularly the panelists for bringing their expertise here. Thanks a great deal. There is a press statement available to people covering the World Trade Center situation concerning the 5th Battalion and the letter that the New York Times reported last weekend.
Send your comments about this forum on terrorism to the National Press Foundation, 1282 National Press Building, Washington, D.C. The zip code is 20045.